Trump, the current president of the United States, walked onto the stage of Stephen Colbert's show with a characteristic confidence that had become his trademark. In his gaze was the same determination that had accompanied him throughout his presidency, but today the atmosphere was different. The noise in the studio quieted as Stephen greeted Trump. "Thank you for joining us, Mr. President. This is your first appearance on my show since your last national address. How are you feeling?" he asked, trying to start the conversation on a friendly note. Trump smiled, but his smile was cold and tired, almost mechanical. "I'm fine, Stephen. You know I'm always happy to be here," he replied, his eyes scanning the audience. Although the show was formal, Trump couldn't shake the feeling that there was tension in the air. His gaze instinctively landed on Colbert, who was already preparing his next question. Stephen, sensing the moment, decided to ask the tough question. "We've talked a lot about your actions in office, and recently the news has once again stirred up around you. What do you say about the accusations of manipulation that have been coming up again? What is really going on?" Trump instantly changed his expression, though he tried to remain calm. "These are absolutely baseless accusations, Stephen. As always, this is just a political attack on me," he responded, trying to keep his emotions in check. "But the recordings, the letters, the testimonies. This could be a serious issue for your administration," Colbert pointed out. Trump paused. His gaze darkened, and although he tried to maintain his usual composure, there was a hint of aggression in his voice. "What more do you need, Stephen? I'm doing everything in my power to serve this country," he said, raising his voice but trying not to lose control. At that moment, the atmosphere in the studio shifted. The audience went silent, all sensing that the conversation was on the verge of breaking down. Stephen, noticing the tension, tried to diffuse the situation. "Mr. President, we're not here to fight. Let's try to find some common ground." But Trump didn't look away, maintaining his firmness. "You want to hear the truth? I won't stop. You can attack me, but I'll keep doing my job," he said with resolute determination. The audience waited for the next move. Trump understood that his words could have significant consequences, but he had no intention of backing down. Would he manage to maintain his composure, or would this meeting become the beginning of another conflict that would change his political path? It was still unclear, but there was already a hint in his gaze that he was ready for the next round. The studio fell silent, every gaze directed at Trump, who stood on the edge of an emotional explosion. Stephen, trying to regain control of the situation, raised his hand. "Mr. President, let's try to understand why you're reacting so strongly to these questions. This isn't just a political attack. These are serious accusations that affect not only you, but also everyone around you. Can you explain why it's so important to reject these accusations right now?" Trump didn't respond immediately. He stepped back, trying to collect himself, but his eyes remained tense, and his lips were pressed tightly together. The studio literally buzzed with a quiet hum that gradually grew into noise. "This is absolutely false. It's all just fabrications from my political opponents. They can't accept that I'm still fulfilling my promises. You've heard this so many times. They will attack me because I won't bow to their will." Trump practically growled, addressing Colbert as if defending his honor in a political battle. Stephen tried to keep the situation under control, but it was difficult. He felt that he would have to do more than just lead the conversation. He would have to confront Trump's volatile nature. "Mr. President, I understand you want to present this as a political struggle, but these are specific accusations that could undermine public trust. People deserve the truth." Trump suddenly raised his hand as if to stop Stephen, but it seemed more like an attempt to control his nerves. "People deserve the truth? I'll tell you what they deserve. They deserve a strong country. They deserve stability. And that's exactly what I'm giving them." And who are you to tell me what's right for America? His voice shattered the silence, and every word was sharp like a challenge. Tension filled the studio. Colbert remained calm, but his expression reflected a true internal conflict. He knew that this moment could determine not only the course of the show, but also how the public would perceive Trump. Mr. President, you know that your leadership style sparks a lot of controversy, but that doesn't give you the right to avoid accountability. And this isn't just about politics, it's about trust in your administration. People want answers to these accusations. They want to see that you're ready for dialogue. Trump frowned and took a few steps forward. His face moved closer to the camera, and for a moment it seemed like he was about to explode. I don't have to justify myself to you or anyone else, he shouted, his voice growing harsher. You just want to humiliate me. You want to show that I'm not the leader I am. But I'll tell you this, I'm not going to stand by and let people tear down my reputation with these empty accusations. The audience, which had been watching with interest, now began to glance nervously at each other. The tension in the studio was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. There was a sense that this moment could be a turning point. Colbert couldn't keep his calm. He abruptly leaned back, watching the president with a look that reflected his frustration, speaking now in a much firmer tone. Mr. President, you still haven't answered the question. Are you afraid? Because it's going to be hard for them to accept the fact that the truth is on your side. Trump felt the situation slipping out of control. He looked confused, but at the same time, he wasn't willing to back down. His eyes gleamed with anger and defiance, but there was a faint trace of concern on his face. The studio held its breath. I'm not afraid of anyone. And you know it, Trump responded with clear aggression, then suddenly rose from his seat. And then, when everything seemed on the verge of catastrophe, Trump abruptly stormed out of his seat, trying to leave the studio without warning and without a goodbye. The noise in the studio grew louder as the doors slammed behind him. The temporary silence that followed his exit was deafening. Stephen remained sitting, watching as the situation unfolded in a way he had never expected. The studio doors hadn't even fully closed when the audience began nervously glancing at each other. The cameras remained fixed on the empty chair where Trump had been sitting just seconds ago. Stephen Colbert sat at the desk, silently observing the situation, trying to gather his thoughts. The studio filled with whispers and impatient anticipation. It seemed like everything was about to spiral into chaos. The host tried to regain control of the situation, but his voice no longer carried the usual firmness. He knew he couldn't simply make everything return to normal. Sorry, but this is probably the most unexpected turn of events I've ever seen on this show, he said with a strained smile. Nevertheless, we'll of course continue. And at that exact moment, real movement started behind the scenes. Stephen noticed several men in dark suits rushing toward the studio. They were clearly part of Trump's security, but their appearance and swift response suggested they were expecting even more trouble. What's going on? One of the producers quietly asked Colbert, clear concern in his voice. Stephen barely noticed the look of alarm crossing the face of one of Trump's security guards. He couldn't pinpoint anything specific, but the atmosphere was undeniably tense. This was only the beginning of a major conflict. The host tried to make himself act, but he felt the current moment was more than just a show. He clenched his fist, nervously thinking about the potential consequences if this incident wasn't resolved. We need to be careful, he muttered to himself, as if trying to reassure himself that everything was still under control. This is more than just a political show. Lost in his thoughts, Stephen didn't notice when one of Trump's security guards approached him. He was large, with a massive build, dressed in a black suit. His face was stone cold, and Colbert could see a mixture of concern and menace in his eyes. Sorry, but the show is over for you. You can't just interfere with our business, the guard said quietly, but with a stubbornness that made it clear he had serious intentions. Stephen tried to keep things light, but he felt his heart race. The look in the guard's eyes left no room for doubt. This situation was dangerous. "Listen, we're just trying to run a show," he said, but his voice lacked confidence. "This shouldn't end like this." The guard shook his head and stepped back, taking a deep breath as if preparing for an even bigger confrontation. "You don't understand. You've crossed the line. This isn't just a political debate, Stephen. Now it's a matter of security." Colbert watched as more security personnel continued to organize, preparing to block the studio, and in his mind, the question immediately arose. Could this situation escalate even further? Meanwhile, on the other side of the studio, a phone call rang through. Operators immediately turned their attention to the screen. There was only one question left. Was this just a game, or could this incident lead to an even greater escalation of the conflict? The studio fell silent, and all attention was focused on what would happen next. At the moment when the guard took another step back, two men in black suits suddenly ran into the studio from the other side. More security, but this time with clear signs of aggression on their faces. Trump's security was ready for anything, and it seemed like this incident was just the beginning of something much more serious. "What's going on here?" Colbert's voice sounded a little sharper than he intended. He was trying to keep the situation under control, but its scale felt like an avalanche coming down. "Is this your show?" one of the newly arrived guards rhetorically asked, looking at Colbert as if he had just broken some serious agreement. Everyone in the studio fell silent, watching closely as the situation unfolded. "We're not looking for a conflict." Colbert took a step back, not taking his eyes off the men who were getting closer. He felt his heart rate quicken. "It's just a show, but if the situation gets out of hand, we'll have to cut the broadcast." One of the guards, large with a sly look in his eyes, approached the desk where Colbert was sitting and slammed his fist down on the surface. The studio jolted from the sound. "You don't understand. Trump is not in the mood for a show right now," he said, his voice thick with an accent that signaled he was ready for even more aggressive actions. Stephen saw the cameras begin to lose focus, and operators were reviewing their plans on monitors, trying to figure out how to handle the situation. Meanwhile, producers started whispering urgently, trying to understand what to do next. "We can't just stop this, Stephen," one of the workers, standing nearby, whispered, her face tense. Colbert knew their broadcast could be lost, and now the responsibility weighed heavily on him. He stared into the guards' eyes, hoping they would understand. He was ready to go all the way, even if it meant taking risks. "I don't know what you're planning, but I'm not going to let this show be broken," he said, trying to stand firm. His gaze was resolute, though inside he understood the situation was becoming more dangerous by the second. But at that moment, the studio doors suddenly swung open. Everyone turned, and there stood Trump in the doorway. His expression was unchanged. He wasn't backing down. "Let's finish this, Stephen." His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable resolve in it. The show must go on. However, there was something even bigger in the way he entered the stage. He knew every step he took would draw attention, and now he was ready to become the central figure in this major conflict. One that had grown to a scale that would have been unimaginable just a few minutes ago. The studio descended into chaos. Security increasingly surrounded Stephen and Trump, and the cameras started capturing emotions that were never meant to appear on screen. And the situation, which had escalated into an unpredictable conflict within minutes, was slowly reaching its peak. Colbert glanced at Trump again, and a moment of doubt flickered in his eyes. He realized he could no longer control this moment. The studio fell silent. The microphones picked up even the smallest sounds, and everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Ignoring the stares of the security, Trump stepped forward. His movements were confident, even slightly defiant, as if he was already used to being the center of attention. But his gaze toward Colbert was cold, like ice. "I've come to finish this show, Stephen," he said, though his voice was soft, almost suspicious. "Is this your show, Donald?" Colbert responded in a tone to match. But there was no aggression in his words, just mild surprise. A pause lingered between them, seeming to stretch for eternity. The studio staff began to feel the tension that was building in the air. The guards seemed unwilling to intervene, but neither were they backing down. Then Stephen took a step back and took a deep breath. He realized that this moment was not just a meeting, it was no longer just a show. It had become a test for him as a host, and for the show he had been running for years. He looked at Trump. "I knew you weren't coming here for a calm conversation, but this is something bigger," Colbert said, maintaining a certain calmness. Trump raised his eyebrows, then nodded and finally spoke, as if deciding it was indeed time to figure out what would happen next. "Now it all depends on you, Stephen." They looked at each other, and then unexpectedly, a microphone in the studio began to speak, the signal to end the broadcast. The noise quieted, and for the next few seconds, it felt like the world had stopped. The studio was once again filled with silence. Colbert, with a smile on his face, nodded to Trump, as if giving him the final word. "Well, dear viewers, it seems this wasn't your ordinary episode," he said into the camera. "But don't forget, the show goes on." When the camera switched off, Colbert looked at Trump, his security, and even his own staff. This broadcast had left an impression on everyone watching, not only because of the tense atmosphere, but also because of how a public figure can always change the rules of the game. And though the broadcast was over, the drama of that evening was only just beginning. A few minutes after the broadcast ended, the studio was once again filled with commotion. Everyone who worked on the show silently gathered their things, exchanging cautious glances, evaluating one another. The security slowly removed their hands from the damaged microphones, while the camera operators began shutting off the cameras, trying to capture the last shots of what had just happened. Trump, still standing by the table, had not moved. His security remained close, watching every move attentively. Colbert approached him, calmly but firmly. "Congratulations, Donald. Didn't think you'd be back on the show so soon." Trump looked at him, his expression still serious. "It was necessary, Stephen. I want people to know the truth. Whatever you're saying, this isn't just a show. It's a real fight." Colbert nodded, as if in understanding. "The truth? That's interesting. But do you really want all this to turn into a fight?" Trump paused, then unexpectedly smiled. "No, I'm not here for that. But if you want the truth, we're all in search of it, aren't we?" Stephen thought for a moment before responding. "We're all here to tell stories. And however you see it, I just want to be honest. I do my job just like you do yours." Honesty. Trump raised an eyebrow. "We're probably looking at this differently." He slowly turned around and addressed his security. It felt like this time they weren't just a team, but observers, ready for whatever might happen next. Trump took a few steps toward the exit, and his voice, even through the noise of the studio, was resolute. "Real change doesn't start with big statements. It starts with small steps." Colbert watched him, realizing that this meeting hadn't ended, but had only marked the beginning of a new phase in their relationship. Some might have seen it as a defeat, but in reality, it was a moment of true realization. And as the studio doors closed behind Trump, Stephen glanced at the camera again. "Maybe I don't agree with a lot of things, but this night will definitely be memorable," he said, a barely noticeable smile appearing on his face. And still, changing people's attitudes is always a step toward progress, maybe even through conflict. The story wasn't over. Its resolution was just beginning. But for everyone sitting in front of their televisions, this moment became proof that every choice has consequences, and even the sharpest conflict can lead to change if we don't ignore the issues. One way or another, the world wouldn't remain the same.